All right. Well, we still have people coming in, but I think we'll get started in order to stay on time. Hi, everyone. I'm Laurel Hansen, MACC's program manager, and I'm joined by my co-moderator, Clara Owen, MACC's communications director. Welcome and thank you all for participating in this MACC Zooms In on centering equity during COVID-19. This convening continues the series of Zoom sessions that bring members together during the COVID crisis. We listen to our members and convene them around issues that matter. Today's convening is a virtual conversation on how MACC members have been and how we can continue centering equity in our ongoing responses to the COVID crisis and in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Take a look at the great members who have registered for today's virtual conversation. On behalf of your network, MACC, we really thank you for being here and being a part of today's discussion. Now I want to share a few directions for participating today. We are being thoughtful about security, and we want you to know that we've taken a number of steps to make sure that this Zoom is a secure conversation. So you can see some of the precautions that we've taken, and we'll be cognizant of the security of our conversations today. We have a few other how-tos about the Zooms. Maybe this is your first Zoom with MACC, maybe not, but if you've been on with us before, you know that we really enable this to be a conversation, a participatory time together. So please feel free to use the chat window. You can also raise your hand and mute and unmute yourself to stop and start your video. And if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll give you the opportunity to make a comment as well. We've got a great turnout, and as people continue to roll in, we'll add them to the conversation. So welcome to everyone as they're coming into this Zoom. Now I would like to introduce MACC's VP of Member Advancement, Tricia Reinwald. We're glad to have her on board today, and she's going to help us frame the conversation that we'll all be participating in. Welcome, Tricia.
Yeah, thanks. That picture reminds me what it was like to be working in an office, like not here in my kitchen. Thanks to all of you for being a part of this conversation today. Many, if not most of your organizations work at the intersection of inequity and well-being, and you do work to lift up the strengths and assets present in the communities you serve. And many of you are working alongside your community in the fight against systemic racism. Part of the framing for our conversation today is really thinking about the fact that racism and COVID-19 are two diseases inflicting disproportionate harm on Black and Brown communities. And as nonprofits, we're working within the very systems that perpetuate that harm. So it gives us a unique opportunity to disrupt things from the inside. At the same time, many of us are also keenly aware of the role the human services sector and social work in general has played in perpetuating racism and harm to Black and Brown communities. So conversation today is an opportunity for us to talk with one another as colleagues about the ways we're thinking and reprioritizing the actions we can take to end the tradition of exclusion, oppression, and violence against our Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities. So the space we've created here is meant to provide an opportunity to share and learn from one another as we walk alongside our communities during this crisis. So we're really grateful for you all being here together. So I just wanted to just take a moment to set the conversation up about this sort of intersection, what we're seeing in community as a result of the COVID-19 crisis and sort of the intersection of racism in all of that. So I'm going to hand it back to Laurel to sort of get us going in our discussion.
Thanks, Tricia. Appreciate it. We're also pleased and thankful to have the opportunity to have the share back of today's breakout conversations to be captured in a visual record. And I'd like to thank and welcome our visual recorder, Jen Mine. And if you've been involved in MACC convenings in the past, you may have already met Jen and seen the fruits of her labor. I'll tell you a little bit about Jen. She's a creative engagement consultant. She designs engagements with intentional thinking around content process and experience. And so she's joining us today to participate and to provide a graphic recording of these conversation sharebacks. So we do have that visual representation of our experience together in addition to the notes that we capture. So without further ado, and again, thanks Jen, she'll be joining us a bit later, but I'd like to introduce the meat of this session, which is our breakout conversations. And we have a couple of questions that we're going to address, but so your breakout room conversations aren't recorded, so we're asking you to take some notes. And we did send the link out in advance, but you'll also see the link to a shared document for capturing some of your small group notes. You'll see that in the chat as well. And I'll just give you a little hint. If you click on it once and it says you don't have access, close it and click on it twice, because we've found that while it might be a little tricky, it will eventually open for you. If not, give us a shout out. This document will allow you to capture some of the highlights of your conversations. And so when we do send you to the breakout rooms, we're going to do 2 rounds, 2 questions. Everyone's going to be talking about the same questions. We're going to provide 20 minutes for each conversation. After the first conversation, we'll come back and we've got a little time for share back. So when you do go to your breakout rooms, first of all, remember the number of your breakout room and know that there is an ask for help button if you need. But you'll want to have somebody volunteer to take a few notes, and then somebody volunteer when we come back together to provide that recap or share back. So you'll want a couple folks to have those assignments within the breakout session. So when you get into the breakout room, introduce yourself, and then we'll discuss the questions. Question number 1 is going to be, COVID-19 has highlighted so many of the inequities present in our communities. What are you witnessing in your organizations, in your communities, and how has your organization responded so far? So again, make sure you do have a couple folks who are capturing and sharing back. And we'll bring you back after the 20-minute round, and we'll go right into the share back. All right. So without further ado, Clara will be sending us all into breakout rooms for discussion. All right. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not sure if everyone's back, but I'll assume we'll move forward. We wanted to work through each group, and we've got about 10 minutes before we have our second conversation. And if you would, Clara, how many groups are there?
There are only 5 groups.
5 groups. So I'll just start with group 1, and I was in that group, so I know that we had a great note taker.
I can do a quick debrief. John was our note taker in our group. So others in the group jump in if I missed something, but we talked about, we have 2 organizations in our group that focus on education. And so a big part of what they were seeing, or what they have been seeing the last few months, is of course the results of the technology gap in families. Joni from Banyan shared a story about one of her families that had 5 children trying to do distance learning on their mom's one phone, and just the lack of access to technology really impacting families. And so and both these organizations talked about work they're trying to do to kind of over the summer try to fill some of those educational gaps with their programming and how they're adjusting. But that's been a huge concern, what they're seeing in the community and how they've been trying to adjust getting technology in the hands of the students that they're working with, and trying to make sure they have the resources that they need. Another thing that came up in our group was a real concern about trying to do proactive outreach to families that are organizations are really concerned about the kind of onslaught of evictions that's likely to begin happening. And so doing that proactive outreach to families ahead of that, so that they don't get so far behind that organizations can't help them catch up. So those are two big themes that came up in our discussion.
Thanks, Tricia. Group 2, would you like to share back around your first round conversation? Somebody want to unmute and speak from group 2?
We had 4 people in our group, although 2 of them were kind of off and not quite still with us, I think now, but Claudia and I will try to punt on this. We had organizations that were involved with basic needs. I'm actually from a suburban organization, Food Shelf and Basic Needs. The other ones are in the city and we're more tied around jobs and housing, refugee and immigrants. And the themes that came up really are somewhat the same as the first one. How do you have people plan for when things are really going to hit hard? So there's been some assistance both for the nonprofits and for their clients in the short term. But at St. Stephen's, they're trying to find jobs for people and they have temporary housing, which is a 3 to 6 month time frame. That's going to run out even when you extend to the 6 months. And despite the fact that there's a lot of people hiring for jobs that don't need a lot of education, the clients they're working with have not been able to get any of these temporary jobs with big box stores or grocery stores or warehouses or those types of things. So they're still without work and without housing, and the 6 month window is probably going to be closing end of summer. So that's a big concern, I think. The other thing was just the technology too, both for trying to see people face to face, even some of the staff or the workers having done more with one-on-one conversations, weren't used to using technology, got thrown into it very quickly. Yeah. In some cases, some of their clients were showing them how they weren't really prepared, not just to innovate with that, but to even have the basics of using that. And there weren't enough resources within their nonprofit to handle that. Claudia, anything else you want to throw in on our group?
No, that was really good. I would emphasize that, and perhaps this is my bias from my vantage point in my organization, but sustainability beyond the sort of the stopgaps that have been sort of thrown our way, which has been great. You know, when we've been able to catch one in the air, but in the long run, how is this all going to good flow? A lot of anxiety around that.
Yeah. Thanks, Group 2, Jan and Claudia. Group 3, do we have somebody that would be willing to share back some conversation points?
I don't remember what group I think I was in group 3.
Go for it.
Okay. And then the rest of my group, please help. We are from a couple of organizations that offer food shelves, and one was Tubman, and I think if anyone doesn't know about Tubman, they offer a safe haven for domestic abuse victims. And I am from Emerge, so we do education and training and workforce. But we all had some similar themes. Organizations had to do furloughs of staff and, you know, bring some staff back, or there are tentative dates to bring staff back. But, you know, see, I can't even read my own notes. Having to change the way programs operate, having to learn how to offer programs and trainings and facilitate meetings via distance, or online, which was challenging for participants that aren't as maybe tech savvy. We've received donations to, give supplies and necessities, extra food, laptops, things for technology. Tracy from Valley Outreach talked about how their food shelf went from, they have a new beautiful facility that people could come in and shop at, and now it's, closed, and they had to go to drive up, prepackaged things for families. And but they've also been able to offer like home deliveries, and they learned that many of the people using the food shelf now are first-time users, families that have been impacted, and have to use those resources. So Tubman representative talked about how they had to move some families to hotels and things like that. There were some overcrowding issues, and then neighborhood house also talked about having to furlough some folks and move parenting classes to online and things like that, and closed their coffee shop, which they were luckily able to transfer those employees over to another part of the organization to work, and just trying to find the silver lining in the way whatever our new normal is going to look like and how we'll offer services. And we've talked about doing continuing these hybrid models going forward and making it more easily accessible for families, instead of always having to come in to our locations and whatnot. So yeah.
Thank you, Melissa, and everyone in group 3. Group 4, representative like to share back? Next group.
I can go. I took notes for our group. So we were 3 different organizations: Interfaith, Sabathani, and Simpson Housing. And we kind of talked about, well, particularly Sabathani, but I think I felt this at Simpson too, that it feels like actually a lot of our coverage shifted in the aftermath of George Floyd to sort of equity specifically. And Sherry at Sabathani, because they're based in the community there, they've been doing a lot of just like really being physically part of the community, reaching out, like supporting community efforts that are happening around them. We talked about, Azia at Interfaith that shared about struggling with like people not even really knowing if their organization is still open, really having a hard time communicating with people who, in the past you've been able to use computer labs and things like that, and now people don't necessarily have internet access. It's, especially if people aren't housed, it's just really tough to reach people and even kind of let them know about what services are available. And that's something that we've struggled with at Simpson as well. We've had we were lucky that some of our programs we had some extra, we got extra money as a result of this. And so we were able to provide computers for some of the folks in our programs. We also, as a response, our shelter shifted to being a 24-hour shelter. And then one of the other things that we touched on was just how the size of the organization really impacts the way that we're able to respond to things. So at Sabathani, they're a staff of 10, they're really diverse, they're really close-knit, so they can really work together effectively to do what, take action on the things that they're seeing that need to happen. At Interfaith, Azia shared that it's really it's not a particularly diverse organization, especially in leadership, and that they've had some struggles in sort of coming to a shared idea of what changes need to happen to respond. And I think Simpson's kind of somewhere in the middle of that, of where we have a pretty white leadership. We're a relatively diverse organization. We've kind of been trying to get there, but are also still kind of struggling to find our shared idea of like what does equity look like in our work. And I would invite either of them to share anything that I missed too.
Thank you, Laura, and group 4. And I think we have one more group to share back from their conversation, group 5. If somebody willing to share back. 5th group, any shares? Anyone who was in group 5 that wants to comment?
I can share.
Oh, Mary, sorry. Thank you, Mary.
So we kind of jumped over what we were witnessing in our organization as far as the COVID piece of it, and went right to equity and racism and what we were doing internally in our organizations. And this was, we had someone from Eastside Neighborhood and Neighborhood House, and then MACC. And the things that I think all of us were doing at this point is really self-educating on what it means to be either racist or anti-racist. And most of us are, again, self-educating. So reading, in particular, the book White Fragility, and then looking at each of our organizations internally and trying to build some policy around what would our organization look like if we were truly anti-racist. I think all of us, our goal is to truly be that way, but when we look at our organization, we can see that we need to make adjustments. And some of the organizations have already studied this for a while and have made some adjustments. Our organization, Family Enhancement Center, had not actively studied this until the death of George Floyd. And now we are, including our board, which I'm really happy that our board actually, they're pushing on this. So kudos to our board and every other board that is so aware of what's going on and how we absolutely need to make change and can't let this opportunity slide by us.
Thank you, Mary, and others who were in group 5. That's an excellent segue into the next conversation too. And I just want to remind folks that we do have our graphic recorder, note taker, Jen, who is fervently working in the background. So at the end of the session, I believe she's going to share some of the visual representation of these conversations. So hang in there for that. We're going to move into the second breakout group. And as before, you'll be sent to different small groups. I assume Zoom's going to mix us up. Want to remind you, open that document. You can see the question. There's a place for your notes. When you get to the group, do have somebody be that note taker and have somebody be willing to recap, and we'll do a share back just like this after the next conversation. So when you get to your groups, introduce yourself, and the discussion question for round 2 you see on the screen. With the convergence of the pandemic and the movement to fight systemic racism, what else can our organizations do to interrupt the harm that's being done to our communities? And what does the next level of work look like in our field? How do we get there? This could be a rich conversation. And I think we have I wish we had a ton of time, but we at least have 15 to 20 minutes for this conversation. So let's go to those groups. Make sure you've opened the document link. Thanks for that update. Who is in group 1? Maybe you'd like to, in the interest of time, just share some highlights from your conversation in group 1. Anyone? We can come back to group 1, group 2. I don't know if folks remember their group numbers. Or just jump in. Who wants to share what their group talked about?
I can share a little bit about our group. I'm just jumping in here, but if someone else wants to jump in, that's great too. Some of the feeling was that the short amount of time between the George Floyd incident and the ongoing disruption or process that everyone is going through to kind of come to terms with that is very short. And so really we're all in some way or another still dealing with that and trying to make sense of what happened and then where are we going with this and how can we be in conversations with policymakers who would make a difference, or we want to be in those conversations to help make that change. But it's not clear. It's not clear on which conversation or how you get there, or yeah, it's just not clear how to move forward.
Truth. Another group want to share? Anyone? Share
We're
some.
group one, so I'll go back, kind of piggyback on what Mary just said too, actually, because we were talking too about, you know, what does the there look like? You know, do we know, and how do we get there? Like, what are those steps? And maybe we don't know exactly what that is, but what are actionable steps we could take out of the learnings that we have going on to be able to just keep moving forward at some pace? You know, and what are our own learnings and education that we need to do, and being really clear about how our communication is, and you know, because this has affected so many more new people that maybe haven't needed services before that are now coming into organizations needing help. And so really making sure that our communication is solid and you know, clear, and that we're willing to just have that openness to help in whatever capacity that looks like. And then how do we raise our voices to kind of be part of the change? Trying to look back at my notes. I don't know, anyone else from my team can jump in too. So it's kind of.
Thanks, Diane. I took notes from our group, which I think was number 3. And we had folks from Eastside, Banyan, and FamilyWise on. Great conversation, and people who have been really thoughtful about their organizations and what's going on and what they want to accomplish. Eastside shared a little bit about the overarching goal within this sort of nonprofit industrial complex, and they used the language to create pathways between community and decision making. So they're really intentionally making space and investing in the work of bringing their teams together and training leadership on how to listen, diverse expression, facilitating spaces across department, leadership, hosting town halls, and wanting to maintain that practice. Reserving a board seat for participants and past program participants, which I thought was really important. And they're also assessing their relationship with the Minneapolis Police Department. They want to be equipped to respond to trauma in an informed way. So a number of approaches there. Banyan shared that they are a diverse organization. Half of their employees are people of color, and that this year they started a program professional development committee that's intentionally made up of people across the organization's different segments, and just to help navigate issues and make sure it's not top down but an inside approach. And Joni said something I thought that was really great. Can't go back to the new normal. Being uncomfortable is important, and we didn't get into this situation overnight, and we won't get out of it overnight. So yeah, a lot of good comments from group 3. Another group, anyone else share back? Group 4 or 5? Don't be shy.
I'll go. I'm not sure what our group number was. I don't know why I'm not paying attention to that. So we had Melissa with Emerge and Asia with Interfaith Outreach. And we all are basic needs organizations to some extent. Emerge doing a lot of training and workforce development, and Interfaith actually is very similar to the organization I represent, Valley Outreach, with multiple programs and basic needs, food shelves and whatnot. And yeah, everybody's at different places in their work. Melissa said they had a regularly scheduled staff meeting that their leader just threw the agenda up in the air and said, let's just talk about things. And please, Melissa and Asia, chime in if you'd like. And she was one of the people who was asked to speak on how she felt things were, you know, with the community and the organization, and how to show up. And, you know, pretty raw conversations from what it sounded like. With Interfaith, Asia said she felt like they weren't moving as quickly as she hoped to, but they do have an individual on their staff who is really leading some of the DEI work, and they're working together on how the organization goes forward. And with Valley Outreach, I shared some of the work we're doing with our board and staff, which started a few years ago. First of all, reading the book A Good Time for the Truth felt like an easy on-ramp. Not too challenging for people, but really eye-opening. We then moved last year to doing IDI assessments across our entire staff and board team, which really brought the ahas to an entire new level. Really great work. And we also embedded in our employee performance plans expectations for equity work for each individual staff member. Our board has a cultural competency working group that is spending a lot of time on the what next. And we devoted the majority of last week's board meeting to how's the organization going to move forward from a suburban point of view. A lot of conversation about our own personal work, but also allies. And that's probably one of the most important things we have to do going forward is how are we allies?
Thanks, Tracy. Any other comments from any other groups? Any share?
I can share. We're group 5. I begged the members of my group to take this so that I wouldn't have to, but they all rejected my pleas, so I will try. One thing that came up kind of loud and clear from everybody in our group was that they're all organizations that have talked and done a lot of work internally in terms of education and professional development and having a DEI kind of lens on their work and maybe even a DEI plan. But George Floyd's murder really caused pretty dramatic shifts in the conversation inside everyone's organization, has raised the urgency to actually follow through on racial equity commitments. And just the urgency. And the other thing we heard too was sort of the board actually starting to like the urgency to be there for them as well. So, and then I think another thing we talked a little bit about, we didn't have a ton of time to get into it, but you know, the conversation about Minneapolis, St. Paul, the dismantle, defund movement, the dismantle, defund police movement, and the media and everybody sort of pointing toward social services and the social sphere is some of the remedy for that. But we also know we have our own issues, right? It's the social work, child welfare. There's a lot of things that happen that perpetuate racism and inequity in our work. We know that. And so that kind of being a concern, and also knowing that probably is a clarion call for all of us in terms of engaging with our city councils around this question, to be at the table around shaping what life looks like after police and what the different world looks like, and also making sure that the work is paid for. Because I personally am quite concerned that cities will slash those police budgets, and then we will continue to be pinched as human service providers. So we talked a little bit about that.
That's a great point. Thanks, Tricia, for sharing that. We don't want to thank you again for everybody for sharing back. We don't want to end the session without showing you the work that Jen's doing to visually record. But before we jump to Jen, Tricia, is there anything lastly you'd like to wrap up with us today? Oh, you're on mute.
There. I just want to quickly say thank you to everybody for being a part of the conversation today. You know, I think we're a really diverse group of human service organizations, and a lot of you are doing a lot of deep work to heal trauma and provide supports and mutual aid that really are designed to remedy the ills of racism and inequity that our country has perpetuated for a long time. And quite frankly, if there wasn't inequity and racism in our systems, many of our organizations would not need to exist. So I think that's a really interesting conversation for us to have. It's really critical we continue to examine our role working within systems that perpetuate racism and working to advance our role in healing and feeding and housing, as well as, I think, as I was kind of pointing toward, like advocating for systems change and taking that work to the next level. So I just want to thank you all for sharing your experience and kind of what you're thinking about in terms of next steps within your organization, and kind of want to invite the dialogue to continue. We're just really grateful to have this gathering space with all of you today.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. We're going to keep the Zoom ball rolling. Our next Zoom will come back online June 9th, and we do intend to have future weekly Zooms, so watch your email for those. We are really interested in the topics that you want to talk about, so reach out to us about that. We're really committed to supporting our network as much as we can in this way, and you can always reach out to us at any time. Now we want to be able to show the visual recording work that Jen's been doing, and she's going to attempt to share her screen and show us her work. So we'll see how that goes. Are you kidding? Wow. Jen,
Well,
tell us about your journey over the last hour while we've been chatting away.
It's been an honor just to listen in and to hear your conversation. I've done my best to capture some of the high points here. And I might edit this a little bit before it gets shared out, but you'll see the first breakout is captured on this side here, where you discuss some of the inequities that you're witnessing and how you're responding. And that conversation seemed to flow very nicely into your second breakout, where you looked at how you're interrupting the harm, how you want to interrupt the harm, and what's next for you. So yeah, there was a lot of great content and efforts underway. I also peeked in at some of the notes that were being captured and tried to bring some of that information in here as well. So again, this will be provided to you in your e-goodie bag.
Yeah.
If there's anything on here that if you feel misrepresents something that you've said, or you want to be sure that I add, please just maybe send a note in the chat and I'll be happy to include it. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Yeah, we'll watch for the final version of the visual recording of this conversation. You'll get it in the e-goodie bag, and you'll also see a really brief survey if you don't mind giving us some feedback about today's session. That's really helpful. Again, thank you for participating. I believe we're going to end right on time, and we just want to wish you well. Best wishes to everyone, and please join us again on the next MACC Zoom. This concludes our session for today. Thank you.
Can I add one last request? For those of you that were taking notes offline that you couldn't access the document, if you could take 2 seconds and email them into info@macc-mn.org. That would be really helpful, and then we'll be able to capture everybody's notes and share them all out to you.
Right on, great suggestion. Thanks, Tricia, and thanks again to everyone for participating today. Be well and have a great day. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.